As big-budget AAA games increasingly focus on delivering larger, more complex open worlds, we're left wondering, what if all that power was instead concentrated into a smaller scale, with a focus on extreme detail? Enter Detroit Become Human, the fifth and perhaps best game from the French studio Quantic Dream. Detroit feels like the complete realization of aspirations set in motion decades earlier. Gone are the sometimes awkward elements which plague the likes of Heavy Rain, replaced instead with a polished presentation quite unlike anything else on the market today. So join me as we step through the many visual achievements present in Detroit Become Human, from its high-quality character rendering to its advanced post-processing pipeline and beyond. There's a lot to explore, so let's get started. Detroit Become Human is built on the latest iteration of Quantic Dream's in-house engine, and is the first original PlayStation 4 title released by this studio. With a lengthy development time, a presumably sizable budget, and a focus on the minutiae rather than a large open world, Detroit can present a level of on-screen detail we rarely see in games today. While Detroit is a PlayStation 4 title, its concept is rooted in a 2012 technical demo presented at GDC known as Kara, which was designed for the PlayStation 3. This demo serves as a teaser for what would become Detroit, while acting as a reference point of sorts for how technology would evolve over the coming years. It still looks good today, but the final game is a significant leap forward. At its core, Detroit shines brightly on both the PlayStation 4 Pro and the original PlayStation 4 console. When using a Pro, Detroit makes use of checkerboard rendering to reach a 2160p pixel count, but many of its post-processing effects are rendered at a much lower resolution to save on performance. On the base system then, Detroit offers a full 1080p image instead. Both versions make use of an extremely high-quality temporal anti-aliasing solution. The move to HDR and PBR combined with many high-contrast scenes in the game can introduce severe aliasing, but the 8-tap TAA used here manages to eliminate edge shimmering and in-surface aliasing. And as a 30fps game, each frame must be completed in 33 milliseconds or less, and the TAA requires just over 1 millisecond of processing time, making it an effective and fast solution. Many control and gameplay concepts return from prior Quantic Dream titles, but have been refined and improved with Detroit. You'll still be moving sticks, pressing buttons, and reacting to prompts, but it often feels as if interactivity has been expanded. In a typical Heavy Rain action sequence, the cutscenes play out, occasionally popping up a QTE prompt requiring the player to react. It works, but it's very basic. With Detroit, however, player control is often retained. Take this scene for instance. During this chase, you're handed full control of your character throughout. You can scan at any time to determine the best route, but you're the one controlling the character's movement. Prompts do appear on screen, but are typically context-sensitive actions rather than hard button prompts required to succeed. The camera system is also excellent. Cinematic angles are used by default, and the R1 button can swap between different directions, but at any time you can simply utilize the right stick, which brings the camera in closer, and it allows you to point the camera wherever you desire. And it's a great feature to have because this is one game where you're going to want to examine the world around you. The goal here was to create an engine that could support a variety of unique environments with lots of dynamic lights, weather conditions such as rain and snow, and advanced direct and indirect lighting. Throughout the game, you'll spend a lot of time exploring virtual chunks of future Detroit along with many locations within, while taking part in conversations with performance-captured characters. The results are nothing short of impressive. According to Quantic Dream's GDC presentations this year then, the latest iteration of its engine utilizes clustered forward rendering, an approach which offers many of the advantages associated with forward rendering while also handling many dynamic lights. Standard forward rendering requires lighting calculations to be performed on every visible vertex and fragment thus making it computationally expensive to render a lot of lights. By breaking the scene into clusters instead, however, it becomes possible to render more lights, which is a perfect fit for the type of world that has been created here. While exploring the game, there's a genuine sense of realism on display, but how is this achieved? Well, it's a complex question, but one key element lies in its materials system. Detroit makes use of physically based rendering to properly simulate roughness and reflectivity of light across different materials. When light reflects off surfaces such as wooden floors, fabrics, or drywall, it dissipates across the surface, while shiny metals or wet pavement present tighter reflections instead, just like real life. And all of those little imperfections and microscopic abrasions present across real life surfaces, well, the utilized BRDF ensures that these are accounted for as well. And thanks to partial energy conservation, light does respect the laws of physics, which roughly means that the reflection of light cannot exceed the brightness of the original light source. All this is to say that, like many other PBR models, materials are designed to react naturally and realistically to incoming light sources. Every environment in the game is lit using a mix of dynamic lights, which are lights which can be moved around the scene, and baked global illumination data. Each scene has its own unique pre-calculated lighting. This interior section, for instance, uses its own data compared to the other adjacent areas. Dynamic objects such as the player characters, which can move between these rooms, sample the data in both rooms and can smoothly transition between them. The game even features jumps between different lighting conditions, such as this. This is also how different times of day are achieved in similar areas. Now obviously, lighting is dramatically more complex than this, but hopefully it's starting to make some sense. The question here then is, what does this actually mean for the player? Well, straight away you'll notice more naturally lit scenes across many different lighting conditions. When exploring Todd's filthy hovel early in the game, the area is predominantly lit indirectly, yet it appears strikingly realistic in practice. Other areas, however, can appear far more vibrant and brightly lit, with reflections everywhere. Detroit will send you through a wide variety of areas like this, and the approach to lighting boosts realism across the board, while also allowing the artist to present even more striking scenes than you might see in real life. It works supremely well in Detroit. By limiting the scope of the game to key areas, however, Quantic Dream was able to focus more of its time and energy into creating unbelievably rich scenery. Many of these features are present in other game engines, of course, but it's the coupling of the robust lighting model with carefully crafted and textured scenery that makes all the difference here. There are certainly plenty of open city areas in Detroit like this, and they showcase the engine at a larger scale, even if it's not quite open world level, but it's more often the confined spaces which impress the most. Another key element in the presentation is character rendering. After all, this is a story-driven game, and you'll be seeing a lot of close-ups of each major character throughout. Detroit makes use of extremely high polygon character models, all superbly shaded, textured, and animated. High-quality models have become increasingly common, of course, but even then, I feel that Detroit reaches new heights in this area. So what is it that allows these digital actors to exhibit such realism? Well, when examining a digitized actor, we tend to first focus on the eyes, and Detroit offers a reasonably good solution here with a bespoke eye shader and eye movement mapped to the performance capture data. As a result, in most scenes, the eyes no longer have that dead feeling you may remember from Heavy Rain. Even more interesting, there is a uniquely perceptible difference between androids and androids with software instability known as deviance. When an android is obeying its master and acting as it should, there's a sense that the eyes of the machine appear slightly less realistic than the humans around them. As they take on more human attributes in the story, however, it seems to slowly change. Then there is the surface of the skin. A screen space subsurface scattering technique is used to simulate light penetration across the skin, and it is of course used heavily throughout. This basically allows light to penetrate and dissipate throughout the skin and fat of the digital actors. When you hold your palm up to a bright light and see a pinkish glow around the edge of your hand, that's subsurface scattering in action. Hair is another key element which is always difficult to render, but the selected technique here generally produces excellent results. Clothing is handled beautifully as well. As the character moves around the scene, the frenel of this character's coat is plainly visible and helps convey a sense of softness to the material, while a physics simulation reminiscent of Assassin's Creed Unity allows for coattails to flap realistically with the wind. It all looks excellent in motion. Cinematic sequences are further enhanced by a combination of close-up lighting and shadows. When engaged in conversation, secondary lights are used for each character, enabling them to stand out in each scene, similar to using a floodlight while filming a subject in real life. Objects within a defined 10-meter radius then receive an additional close-up shadow. This basically means that objects within this area produce cleaner, more defined shadows, which is extremely useful for avoiding typical shadow artifacts you might see in these close-ups. Of course, the character models have always looked pretty good in Quantic's games, but it's the animation and performance of each digital actor that really stands out here. Quantic Dream uses a full performance capture rig to bring the actors and actresses into the virtual world to great effect. The team first utilized this technique with Beyond Two Souls, but the more realistic rendering available in Detroit greatly increases the realism. Characters are further enhanced by excellent bokeh depth of field behind them, which is basically the circular shapes visible in out-of-focus regions. This is a natural occurrence that can be produced using the right lens with a camera, and the shapes presented here are particularly attractive. Really, with Detroit, it genuinely feels as if the developers were focused on simulating a real camera within its virtual world. The concept of interactive cinema has been around for ages, as has post-processing designed to simulate camera behavior. But Detroit goes one step further than usual with even more refined effects. It genuinely feels as if it were shot more like a film than a game. The angles, cuts, and camera tricks all manage to create this feeling, and the aforementioned depth of field is just one part of this. And per object and camera motion blur are another key element used to achieve this sense of realism. The intensity of motion blur in filmed footage varies based on the selected shutter speed of your camera, and virtual shutter speed must be considered when replicating this effect in game. Thankfully, Detroit uses an agreeable speed that looks suitably filmic in motion but manages to avoid obscuring the fine details present throughout the image. Like most post-effects in the game, motion blur is rendered at half resolution to save on performance, but still manages to look quite nice in motion. Another element which supports the idea of a virtual film camera is film grain, which is featured throughout many different sequences. Darker scenes, such as this, which would naturally require a higher ISO with a real camera, exhibit noticeable grain, while brighter, more exposed scenes can appear much clearer in comparison. When these camera effects are combined with the advanced rendering pipeline, the results can appear quite striking, or horrific in the best possible way. I mean, just look at this. Of course, there's more to building atmosphere than camera and lighting tricks alone. One key element in boosting the sense of realism lies in the use of volumetric lighting. When light disperses through the atmosphere, this type of lighting can arise, and Detroit relies heavily on this when it comes to building its atmosphere. These volume lights are temporarily filtered and avoid leaking artifacts as well. Cascaded shadow maps are also beautifully rendered. These PCF shadows use temporal supersampling to present smooth, clean edges, while jittering is combined with TAA to enable smooth transitions between each split. Many light sources can cast dynamic shadows as well. Then there are the reflections. The forecast regularly calls for rain in Detroit, and thus wet surfaces play a significant role in the presentation. What science fiction piece would be complete without this anyways? Reflections are handled using a mix of cube maps and screen space reflections. These reflections are rendered at a reduced resolution but filtered and displayed in such a way as to deliver clean, defined reflections. SSR is key to many scenes, especially when rain or snow is involved. Speaking of which, Detroit features some of the finest weather effects we've seen in any game to date. Rain is a difficult effect to get right, but I feel like Detroit really produces beautiful results. Between the droplets and water spray itself, to the gorgeous water shaders used across the soaking wet city, rain plays a huge role in establishing atmosphere, and it just looks remarkable. The same is of course true of snow particles as well. These weather effects play a key role in establishing the mood necessary to tell this story. I mean, can you imagine Blade Runner without rain? If these effects were implemented poorly, the entire mood would have been spoiled. And that's true of the entire presentation, really. We've examined so many beautiful games over the years, but if you look close enough, there are usually minor faults to be found. That's not really a feeling I get with Detroit. While the vision is certainly more limited in scope, it feels as if every element of the presentation has been executed perfectly. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's rewind and examine the very first major scene in the game while focusing on many of the details that we've already discussed. It's a great chance to reflect back and see how each element can be used to build a highly cohesive scene. And the first thing to notice is the scene itself. It's rather windy on top of this building, but hair and clothing on each character can be observed blowing realistically. As the helicopter flies over the scene then, its spotlight casts proper shadows, while the force of its blades forcefully push lawn furniture across the roof. As the umbrella violently dances in the wind, the pool visible just to the right of the image features beautifully rendered water that appears to react to the force of the chopper as leaves and other particles blow in front of the camera as well. The distant city skyline is always kept just slightly out of focus, giving it a near photorealistic appearance. Reflections are also used throughout the scene while shadows are rendered in a realistic manner. The interface itself is then beautifully integrated into each and every scene in the game. Then there's the character detail. If you pause momentarily here on Daniel, observe some of his finer details. The first thing you notice are the eyes. Look into them and it almost feels as if you're observing a photograph. You might also notice once again how realistically the light plays off of his skin thanks to subsurface scattering. Elsewhere, observe the way in which his teeth and mouth are lit. It's subtle but highly realistic. And how about the small hairs on his neck? Can androids grow beards? Now observe the material used in this pistol. It's suitably diffuse and also features engraved legible text including "Made in USA." Then there's the little girl who has been taken hostage. The tears streaming from her eyes reflect light realistically. You can really sense the fear in her face. And this type of detail is present throughout the game in each and every scene. Lighting, atmospheric effects, weather, detail, and animation are all carefully crafted to create the best possible looking game as often as possible. It's the type of presentation only possible when a more limited scope is used, but it's glorious to behold. Another important consideration to consider is how smoothly Detroit can transition between each scene. Loading screens can spoil the pacing of a game, but during normal play, Detroit manages to keep them to an absolute minimum. By moving necessary assets in and out of memory at strategic moments, Detroit can jump between entirely different locations without a hiccup. In previous Quantic Dream titles such as Beyond Two Souls, players could be left at a loading screen between each major scene, which only served to slow down the pacing. By solving this issue entirely, Detroit winds up feeling a lot more cohesive. And that's really a perfect description of the game as a whole, cohesive. From its rendering to its acting and cinematography and even its gameplay, it's fair to say that Detroit has raised the bar for this type of experience. Narrative-driven games have become increasingly popular over the years after all, with titles like the excellent Life is Strange and all the various Telltale games, but most of them are built with a smaller budget and a shorter development time. Detroit, however, demonstrates what can be achieved with sufficient time and resources in this space. It also highlights just how much the team at Quantic Dream has evolved over the years. There was always a certain ambition in its narrative-driven games, but each one ultimately falls short in key areas. Whether it was performance problems, weird presentation quirks, unsatisfying conclusions, or plot holes, the result was never quite what we had hoped. With Detroit, it finally feels as if the team has achieved what it set out to do from the very beginning. It's a beautiful, polished game that manages to perfectly combine its impressive in-house engine with brilliantly realized art, a gripping story, and interesting gameplay opportunities. For now though, we've reached the end of our look into the art and technology powering Detroit. Once we've had more time to spend with the game on the base PlayStation 4 system though, we'll return to it with a more detailed look at performance on both machines while examining any differences that may exist. For now though, I hope you've enjoyed this look at the game, and if so, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell in order to keep up with what we're doing. It really does help. And if you have any questions or comments, be sure to hit us up on Twitter. And until next time, this is John signing off.